Hi and welcome to another P5 Masterclass video. This time we're going to be looking at the new cloud storage that's possible in version 5.5. I've got 5.5 installed here, as you can see. All I've done so far is provided a demo license to activate it. We're going to begin by looking at doing a cloud backup. Backup and archive to cloud is pretty much the same, but I'll cover the archive side a little bit later on as well. You'll see on the left hand side with P5.5 you've now got cloud service, and cloud service is basically where you hook yourself up to either Amazon S3. In fact, I can just show you if I click on new service. These are the supported services currently. There are others coming quite soon. We're currently on version 5.5.4, which supports Amazon S3, Amazon Glacier, generic S3 services such as Wasabi and Backblaze B2. So for my testing today, I'm going to be using Amazon S3. The setup of the cloud service, so how you set up your account with Amazon so that you can have some S3 storage available to you, will be outside of this video. So you'll need to go and investigate Amazon S3 or Backblaze or whatever you're interested in and get that set up. When you do that, you'll get some kind of login credentials that allow you to access your cloud storage. And it's those login credentials that you put into the UI of P5 here, for example, for S3, in order to allow S3 to use the cloud service that you have set up and that you are able to pay for. So before we go into the actual setup, I'm just going to talk a little bit about how cloud services and pools and volumes all fit together in this new world of cloud storage, just so that you've got a bit of knowledge to underpin what we're going to do next. Let's have a look at volumes and how we work with volumes and chunks with P5 in order to get data uploaded and downloaded from cloud storage. So on my whiteboard here, I've got a P5 server over on the left hand side, and to that I'm going to add some storage, and the storage is where I will create a disk library, create some volumes, and then I'll show you how those volumes can then get copied up into the cloud. So what does a volume look like? Well, in P5.5 and upwards, each volume is represented by a folder. So previously a volume was just a file on disk, but in the newer version a volume is a folder, and that's so that the folder can be broken down into lots of what we call chunks. So these white squares in my volume here are chunks, and those are basically smaller files, and those are uploaded and downloaded to cloud storage, and they're smaller so that it's more convenient and you're not uploading and downloading any more data than you need to. The default is 128 megabytes for a chunk. So your volume, if it was, let's say, 500 gigabytes in total, might contain many hundreds of these chunk files. So what happens when we run a job is we're taking data from some kind of storage, writing that to the volume, be it a backup or an archive job that we're running, and the data is arriving into the volume, and what happens is that the first chunk in the volume is written to and eventually filled up when you've written 128 megabytes of data, and then we start writing data to the next chunk, and maybe the job doesn't require that two whole chunks are filled up, so we've got about, let's say, 150 megabytes here. So each time a chunk file is filled up to its 128 megabyte limit, and this figure here is configurable, so you can change that. Then over here, if I bring in my cloud storage, so let's say we've got an S3 connection here, and I've got a bucket over here, which is what S3 calls the unit of storage that you're going to be uploading to. The first chunk here, once it was filled up, gets uploaded into my bucket, and then the second chunk doesn't get filled, but that also gets uploaded to the cloud bucket, and then the job completes. So now we've got two chunks over here residing in our S3 bucket, and if you've configured the storage to remove local copies, then these two chunks over here will be deleted. So your local storage is just being used temporarily to store the chunks up to the point that they're uploaded into the cloud. Optionally, you can keep all of the chunks local, so then you effectively have a disk-based backup and a cloud backup at the same time. Obviously, you need to make sure that you've got plenty of storage available on disk so that you don't run out of space. So that's how chunks work. They're uploaded into cloud storage, And of course this could be Backblaze or S3 generic or any of the cloud storage services that we support, and the files remain in the bucket. If I run a job later and finish writing this chunk here and start writing the next one, then the previous version of this chunk here gets deleted from the cloud, and the two additional chunks that we've just written get copied up, so that the cloud always reflects everything that's been written to chunks within the local volume. Of course, when it comes to restoring, Archiware P5 will, if necessary, retrieve the necessary chunks back to the local storage, and then your restore job can write everything back as required. Okay, so back into the P5 UI here. What we're going to do is go back to Cloud Service. We are now going to configure some cloud storage for backup to Amazon S3. And I already have an Amazon S3 bucket set up. In fact, I can show you that. So here is my Amazon S3 bucket. I'm just using a Mac app here called Transmit, which allows me to browse my bucket in the cloud. My bucket is called P5 Backup Training, and it's currently empty. So this is waiting for some data to arrive. So back into P5, I'm going to set up, rather than doing an individual cloud service and hooking it all up manually, I'm going to use the Add Cloud Storage wizard over here, which basically takes me through all the steps needed to do all of the bits and pieces that we need to get this working. So step 1 is to add the cloud service. Step 2 is to determine how the volumes are going to be stored locally. They're divided into chunks, as you just saw. 128 megabytes is the default chunk size. We'll stick with that. And I'm going to choose not to keep a local copy, but we'll come to that in a sec. Step 3 is to choose the local storage directory where we are going to stage the data before it goes up to the cloud. We can optionally keep all of that data locally as well, so that we have both the cloud and a local copy of our backup data, which might be what you want. And then at the bottom, step 4, we're deciding of our media management and storage licenses that we have in our installation, how much of that do we want to devote to cloud storage. So first of all, step 1, let's add a new cloud service. And the cloud service I want to use is Amazon S3, as I just said, and I have an access key and a secret access key available. I'm just going to key those in now. Is P5 Backup Training, as you just saw in the S3 client. And I can choose how many parallel uploads I would like to have P5 running up to S3 or whatever the cloud service is. I'm going to pick 2 so that we can see what that does. Let's apply those changes. I can immediately hit the test button now, which will very quickly let me know if it's working. It is, that's good news, connected successfully. So I can now apply, well, I can now continue back into the wizard. You'll see now that Amazon S3 is showing up as the cloud service. I've created that. I don't want to keep a local copy of my data, so when I do this backup I'm going to run in a minute, I just want that data to go into the cloud so that when I do a restore, the data will be being recovered from the cloud. The default chunk size is fine. Certainly for S3 I would always recommend sticking with the default size. And then my local storage directory, I am going to pick this directory that I've already created up here on the desktop, which is currently empty. So let's just browse for that one. Okay, so that one is now pointing to this one on the desktop. And I would like to have 500 gigabytes of storage made available via this local disk storage linked up to the cloud storage. And this will result in the relevant number of media management licenses being used up. So let's apply that one. It spins for a second, and the reason it's spinning is because it's kicking off a job, and we can monitor that job via the job monitor in the usual way. There's lots of prior P5 Masterclass videos that will take you through all the basics. So what's happening now is we're creating some volumes, and we are, in the process of creating those volumes, we're creating some chunk files within the volumes, and those chunk files are being uploaded to Amazon S3 so that all the volumes that we're creating locally are also represented in the cloud. There will be a number of these volumes created according to the way that the local disk storage was configured. And if we just have a quick look at that, under Storage Manager, what we just did resulted in a local disk library being created, which, in order to provide 500 gigabytes of storage, will have 10 volumes, each of which is 50 gigabytes in size, up to 50 gigabytes in size. So this job is in the business currently of creating 10 volumes, and it looks like it's on number 7. Now this runs slightly slower than you would expect for a disk-based labeling job, because for each volume, as I said, there is a little bit of uploading into Amazon S3 going on. When this is finished, I'll show you what is in both the local folder and in the S3 bucket, so you've got a feel for what's happening so far. So currently the 10th volume is being labelled, and then that job will finish. And flick down to the bottom with a green light, and if we look at the detail, we'll see that 10 volumes were created. So let's close the job monitor. In my local folder over here, here's my 10 volumes. Now, if you're familiar with versions prior to 5.5, you'll know that each volume on disk would have been created as a single file. So we would have had a single file times 10 volumes, and each one of those files would have grown to 50 gigabytes in size in order to accommodate the data from your backup. The re-engineering of 5.5 means that all volumes created on disk are now created as folders, and they're created as folders so that they can be divided up into a number of chunks. Here's a chunk, 127 kilobytes chunk. There's no real data being written into this volume, but when there is, we'll see multiple chunks appearing in this folder, each of which can grow up to 128 megabytes in size before we move on and create the next chunk. Each time we finish writing a chunk, though, that chunk will be uploaded into our, in this case, S3 bucket, and then deleted locally, so that your local storage isn't being used effectively. We're just using the local storage to write the chunks up to their full 128 megabyte size, and then we'll upload them into the cloud. So if we now look in our cloud bucket, and I refresh this so we can see what's in here, this has now gone from being empty to containing basically the same data that we see in the Finder on the local copy. So everything is the same at the moment. We've got some stuff locally on disk and the same things in the S3 bucket. So now if we run a backup, we will see pools being created and uploaded. So let's do that next. So back to the main P5 window. Before we do that though, let me just show you how things are linked up. So we've got this disk library here, which is responsible for the local copies of those volumes. We also have a pool that was created by the wizard, the Cloud Backup pool. If we look at this, you'll see that this pool is assigned to the Amazon S3 cloud service. It's not keeping a local copy of the data, and the chunk size is set to 128 megabytes. These menus are grayed out because these decisions have already been made and we've labeled volumes, so you can't change these things once you've started to create volumes. We then have labeled volumes in the storage manager, and because the volumes reside in this pool which is connected to the cloud service, that's what causes the volume chunks to be uploaded into the cloud. Finally, if I list the volumes, you can see our 10 volumes listed here. So let's make a backup plan via the new button. Let's call this S3 Cloud Backup, and what I'm going to do is just select a couple of local folders to back up, just to demonstrate how it works. So I'm going to choose localhost as the source for the data and choose a couple of folders. Okay, so I've chosen a folder that contains lots of small files and a folder that relates to this one for backup on my desktop that's got 325 megabytes in it. So that's fine. And now under backup events, I just want to set this up to run an incremental backup on Monday through Friday. And I want this to go to my Amazon S3 backup pool, the one that we've just created. So let's apply that. Let's apply the whole job. And let's run this job manually. So I'm going to run incremental backup of localhost, start now. And let's monitor that job to see what's happening. So as soon as this job starts to collect data from the client, it's going to start writing into the chunk files, which I think we can already see here in the Finder. You'll see that there are now chunks number 1, 2, and 3 being written. And remember, these chunks will be up to about 128 megabytes in size each, up to the point that they're full. So with 3 chunks having now been written, there will be an upload taking place to S3. And that's visible in the job monitor down here. So you see where it says copy volumes, volume 10,001, which is the ID of the volume that we wrote, and it's copying chunks. And because we allowed 2 upload streams at a time in order to upload these 3 chunks that have been written to disk, there are currently 2 chunks being written to the S3 bucket, and then there'll be another one that will be written once one of those 2 has finished copying. P5 gives us stats here about how big each of those 2 chunks is and the percentage that's been written so far. My upload bandwidth where I am recording from is quite slow, so this isn't uploading particularly fast. So what I'm going to do is wind things forward a bit in a sec so that we can get to the end of this job, and then we'll have a look in the S3 bucket to see what's been uploaded. Okay, so that job just finished. Another green dot, which is good news, and if we look at the detail for that job, it looks pretty much like any kind of backup. Tells us that it's been writing to this volume ID 10,001, but of course within that volume there are a number of chunks which have also been uploaded to S3. So let's have a look both on our local storage and on the cloud storage. The chunks numbered from 1 to 5 were actually written to the cloud storage, but 4 of them, numbers 1 through 4, have been deleted from the local storage because that's what we requested P5 does. We don't want to keep a local copy. This 5th volume here, this 5th chunk rather, has only been partially written, so this one is kept so that next time the job runs it can continue adding data to this chunk. Now if we look in our cloud bucket over here and I refresh this view, you can see that chunks numbers 1 through 5 exist in our cloud bucket, some of which are up to the full size of 128 megabytes approximately, and some are not. But this is all the data from our backup that now resides in our S3 bucket. Normally you're not going to be looking inside of the volume folders or in the cloud storage at the chunks, but I'm just showing you this so that you can see the mechanics of how this job actually works. So if we were to restore something from this backup now, we would need to be downloading some of the chunks from S3 in order for that restore to run, because the data is no longer stored locally. So let's have a look at doing that. So let's go back to the main P5 window. We're going to browse into the backup index for the data that we just backed up. Backed up this folder and a couple of different folders within it. On the desktop, I've got this backup folder that has a 271 megabyte file and a 12 megabyte file. So let's try recovering a couple of these smaller files back from the backup. Let's click Restore To, and I'm going to relocate back to my currently logged in users desktop folder. And the backup will let us know that it's volume 10,001 that's needed to perform this backup, which is available since the folder that represents that volume is available in the disk library, although the data, some of it will need to be retrieved from S3. So if I hit the start button and then we monitor this job, we'll see some downloading of chunks taking place in order for these files to be restored. So you can see that the first chunk is being downloaded. So we are downloading 4% so far of about 100 megabytes of this in this particular chunk, which is chunk number 2, you can see above there. So that's probably the chunk that has the files in that we're restoring. Again, I'll spin this forward a bit so we're not waiting too long. Okay, so that chunk is just finishing being downloaded, and you can now see the 2 files that we restored are now visible on the desktop. So the restore completed, and in order to restore it had to download 1 chunk. If we look back in the Finder window, you'll see that the chunk that we downloaded is now remains on disk for the time being, but will get tidied up by P5 as part of its housekeeping processes that happen each day. So although that's been downloaded, it won't remain on disk, taking up disk space that you might not want it to. Okay, so let's close a couple of windows down. So that covers the basics of how to set up a cloud service. Now let's look at archive, the setup of the cloud storage is in fact exactly the same, but this time I'm going to go round a slightly longer way and set everything up manually so you can see how everything works in a bit more detail. Okay, so let's make a new folder on the desktop for our archive cloud storage to be kind of cached from. Again, I'm going to use S3 archive, let's call it the same kind of thing, cloud archive storage. And first step is going to be to create a disk library hosted in that folder. So under Storage Manager, here's the disk library that's hosted up here in this folder that we created via the wizard. We're going to create a new disk library located in the folder that we just created. There's the directory. I'm only going to use 10 gigabytes of space. Let's make this quite small, and we don't want to label any volumes yet. We're going to do that manually once we've created the pool and hooked that up to the cloud. So after a couple of spins, we'll be able to see our disk library number 2. We could give it a better description, so let's call it disk library for archive to S3. And you can see here that there'll be 5 slots or 5 volumes within this library, each of 2 gigabytes in size. So with that done, what we'll do next is go create a cloud service. So here is the Amazon S3 service that we created or was created by the wizard. This one's for backup, so let's call it backup in the description so we can distinguish that one from the one we're about to create, which will be for archive. So let's create a new service. And again, Amazon S3, I will just put in my access key and secret access key. And this time I'm using a different bucket called P5 Archive Training. And we'll use 2 parallel upload streams again. So let's apply that. We can test again, make sure it works. It does. And close it. In my window here, I've got the P5 Archive Training bucket already visible, so we can see what's being uploaded into that bucket once we start doing some labeling. Probably makes sense that the description for this one says archive, so let's just do that. And there we go, we've got our 2 cloud services set up. So next we're going to make a pool. Here's the pool for the backup, so let's make a new one manually. This is going to be called Amazon S3 Archive, and it's going to be used for archiving. We will assign a cloud service, so whilst the media type is disk, so it's going to go into this disk library here, it will also get copied to the cloud service that we specify, which will be this one. In this case, I'll again not keep the local copy. Archiware suggests here that if you do keep a local copy, then your restores will be faster and you'll have the data in 2 places, so you've got greater security and availability. And there'll be no retrieval costs from the cloud service, but obviously you've got to provision the local disk storage, so it's up to you how you want to play that. So I'm not going to keep a local copy, and I'm going to keep the chunk size set to the default of 128 megabytes again. So closing that, now we have our archive pool alongside our backup pool. The backup pool has 10 volumes. Currently the archive pool has none because we haven't done any labeling yet, but that's the next step. So back to the Storage Manager for our archive pool, hit the label button, and then we have these 5 volumes that we could create. I'll just create 3 because that'll be a bit quicker. And we'll choose the Amazon S3 archive pool, that's the one that we just created, and let's hit label. So that will trigger a job which will run in the job monitor, and if we look at the detail for that job, we can see the second volume is now being labeled, and as part of that labeling, the initial chunk that gets created on disk will get copied up to our S3 bucket. So if we look at the S3 bucket here, we can now see the 3 volume ID folders that relate to the 3 volumes back over here that have just been created, 23, 24, 25 there. And of course those also exist in our Cloud Archive Storage folder. So now everything is the same. We have our chunks inside of here, and we have our chunks in the cloud as well here. So now we can create an archive plan, archive some files, and restore and just make sure that that works. So back to the main window, Under Archive, let's create an archive plan. Let's just call it S3 Archiver. The target storage will be our S3 archive pool that we just created. The target index is fine, and this is just a test, so I don't need to configure anything else about this archive plan. I can just go ahead and use it. So under manual archiving, I've got my a location called archive from here, which is actually just this backup folder on the desktop where we've got a couple of PSD files. So let's archive 2 PSD files and specify our S3 archiver as the target storage. And then if we monitor that job, we should be able to see the data being written both locally and then synchronized up to the cloud storage. So now you can see that we are copying volume 10,023 chunks up to the cloud. It's 55% of the way through. Just a 12 megabytes worth of data was written into that chunk because we didn't archive very much, so that will upload quite quickly, and I suspect the job is about to finish. Let's go looking in the cloud storage then, and if I just update, you can see now that there's the 12 megabyte chunk that was written both locally and into the cloud. And if we look in our folder, we'll also see that chunk. It's not yet been written up to its 128 megabytes yet, so it remains on disk so that it can be further appended to, and then each change to that chunk will get synchronized up to the cloud following any subsequent jobs that run. When the chunk is filled and we move on to the next chunk, the local copy of that will be removed. We could, just as a test though, remove that chunk now from disk, which will force P5 to pull this copy of it back from the S3 bucket. So just to prove that is the way that things work, if we go to our archive index and browse down to locate what we just archived, then if we choose to restore these 2 PSD files back to the desktop and then monitor the running of that job, we'll see that the chunk will be downloaded from the cloud to facilitate those PSD files appearing on the desktop, which will happen rather quickly because there they already are. And the job monitor is was just showing us that it was pulling the chunk down. So there you go. So there's an archive to the cloud and a restore, and it didn't take very long. So that is how you go about configuring P5's new cloud storage, both using the wizard. So under cloud services, you've got add cloud storage, which provides this interface, which basically sets everything up for you and ties it all together. Or you can set up cloud services manually, which is what we just went through. Okay, so thanks for watching this video. Hope that was useful. See you in the next video. Bye.